and pushing too far. We pushed too far. It's so, the calculation may be that this will take longer than 6 months because this is a bigger deal, but we'll get over it. That was an important calculation. By 2011, two things happened. Libya happened, and the Russian vote at the Security Council to abstain, which led to Operation Unified Protector, which Sweden was very involved in, was actually regime change. That told him that for international issues, no more. We will stop the Security Council, and Mr. Putin's been very effective at stopping the Security Council in Syria and elsewhere. And then, of course, the end of 2011 came the Tandem decision, the largest mobilization of Russian society against what they were perceived as not having given a choice, I think began a process which said, we are going to change the rules. We are playing by our rules, not by the West's rules. And again, I think you can see the Good Friday test in 2013 as the beginning of a new ramp-up phase. So let's be clear about the risk. Let's be clear about what NATO can and cannot do for Sweden. And let's hope that we all can assess the problem, develop the leadership that we need to address the problem, and be willing to bear the sacrifice that this will take to confront this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. I will soon let Magnus comment on that. Just one little question. Since you brought it up yourself, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you're not a state official, that you're an analyst. So therefore, you're free to give us recommendations.
Once we get liberated from the government, we just can't stop ourselves. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So besides saying that Sweden should give some serious thought to our future and to the security situation in Europe, do you have any concrete recommendations on what decisions, in fact, we should take?
Look, I mean, I think we have been concerned. This goes across Europe, but Sweden is an example of this, though not a NATO member. Everybody has been taking advantage, understandably, of both the peace dividend, and if you can get security on free, that's a good thing to do. Get security free. The U.S. is the enabler of this policy. The Americans have got our backs, so we don't actually have to spend the money. Well, I think, as I said, I'd like to dispel some myths here. NATO, while always hoping to help, now has responsibilities to protect its own members. That's a focusing activity. And the U.S. is actually going to have to work hard. It's removed a lot of its conventional capabilities. It's going to have to do some soul searching about what it needs to do budget-wise. And I assure you, I can already hear the voices in Congress that says, okay, we're willing to do our part, but if we don't see the Europeans doing their part, we're going to do less. That's as honest, and you deserve a very honest comment. That's the challenge. So, and I think it's been, Swedish defenses have been, the cuts have been quite dramatic. Your own leadership has told you that. I'm not telling you anything you haven't heard from your own leadership. You can't turn the dime on this, and the problem is, the speed at which this is happening, and 40,000 Russian troops mobilized on Ukrainian border. Friends, we don't have time. We're already behind. So you're going to have to make some very rapid decisions. This is why my concern about, gosh, we have a really big election and we've got to get this behind us. You can't do that. You have to decide now. You have to start putting this resolve and building these forces now, because you're going to get tested again. And it was very interesting in Tallinn to hear where you are now the strategic vulnerability in the region, not the Baltic states. So, which is, I have never thought of it that way, but I understood it to that perspective. So you've got a lot of assessments to make, very fast decisions, and these are painful decisions, and these reawaken painful memories. Your historical memories will want to take you one place. Your strong sense about the importance of the United Nations and the international system and the principle of territorial integrity will push you another way. And this is tough. This is tough, tough stuff. I, would never tell you what to do. I just want you to assess the situation very seriously and hopefully come to some important conclusions.
Thank you, Heather. Now, Magnus, please.
Great, thank you. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to come speak, and thank you all for showing up. It's especially fun for me as a Swedish American to be in Stockholm to talk about NATO and transatlantic security. So this is fun. And thank you, Heather. I thought that was a great picture you painted of all the challenges and where we find ourselves. So what I thought I was going to do is sort of riff on some of those themes, perhaps, and perhaps concentrate on sort of now what do we do, or now what should NATO do. And I'll be relatively quick, so we can get to the discussion, because again I would love to hear from you all and what your questions and thoughts are on this. So I want to sort of focus on three broad themes, really. One, NATO's strategic posture. Two, new threats and capabilities, and the third, role of the U.S. And again, all of this in the context that Heather gave here. So I would say at this point, NATO needs to look at a new strategic posture that really can be explained as for lack of a better term, flank strategy, which is something new for NATO. We can go back to Cold War days, right? We almost had a strategy of the center where we all prepared for sort of a good gunfight in Germany in a Cold War context. After that, we did things at a distance. We did Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan. We chased pirates. We did earthquake relief in Pakistan. We did a Libya operation and so forth. But today, I think the issues and challenges are on the flanks, but still closer to home. So certainly Northern Europe, and again, Heather painted that picture quite clearly with the Ukraine crisis, and obviously the timing of this conference is impeccable, and assertive Russia. But I would also throw the Arctic in there, and certainly I'm not one of those that thinks we're all going to go fight in the Arctic, but there are security issues up there to be discussed, and Russia is a player up there too. But then again, there are also differences within the alliance, whether NATO should have a role there or not. Our Canadian and Norwegian colleagues have different opinions, but it's something that needs to be worked out one way or another. And as Heather said, this is hardcore Article 5 kind of issues up in this region, and Sweden finds itself in the middle of it. It's warheads to foreheads, as American military people will sometimes call this this kind of hardcore security. And again, has absolutely major implications for Sweden, its role in the region, its ability to look after its own security interests in the broader region. So that's one flank. But the other flank, let's not forget about the Mediterranean and the Middle East. There's still the Arab awakening is still generating turbulence. And as I said, NATO did do an operation in Libya. Syria is still cooking, and there's continued instability in that region. So on that flank, there may not be so much of an Article 5 discussion, but it is a crisis management and a cooperative security discussion. And there may be a role for NATO in security sector reform. Who knows? Perhaps one beautiful day there may be a NATO peacekeeping role if there ever is an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. And who knows? There may be a Syria operation, a humanitarian one, what have you. Who knows? And I think you actually need both flanks. I get the strong sense that across Europe, that certainly folks in Northern Europe are terribly concerned about Russia, which is very, very understandable. If you go to the south, Spain, Italy, Portugal, France, they're not quite as concerned, but they are really concerned about what's going on across the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of talk about a new transatlantic bargain, which I'll return to, but there may also be a need for sort of an intra-European bargain, that the Northerners need to do things for the Southerners and the Southerners need to do things for the Northerners. So there's actually two flanks at play here, I would argue. So on the second theme, which is sort of new threats and capabilities, and I'll just throw a couple of things on the board. I certainly don't have solutions to these issues, but things that we need to be mindful of. Cyber is, of course, one, which again has been a factor in Estonia, but also during the Ukraine crisis. NATO has made great strides in securing its own networks and so on and so forth, but there's still discussion to be held about cyber capabilities or cyber threats as part of collective defense and security and so forth. So that's something that the alliance needs to move forward on. What is NATO's future maritime role? And again, for very understandable reasons, over the last 10, 15 years, it's been very much a ground-centric alliance. That's certainly the case in Afghanistan, where we've been doing counterinsurgency, and a sort of a second aspect, which has been air power, which is your Libya and Kosovo kind of an effort. But moving forward, I think that there's a real need for a larger maritime role for NATO, both for collective defense and Article 5 in the near neighborhood, so to speak, but also for crisis management and so forth. In Washington, increasingly people think of the 21st century as a maritime century, and maybe NATO needs to get in that game. Third, space. Which is another controversial area, that there are certain NATO allies that don't really want to touch it, but it is one of these sort of behind-the-scenes factors that enable operations and enable ISR targeting, what have you. And at this point, it's catch as you can. Individual allies will offer up resources or results of resources to operations, but that's something that NATO needs to get a handle on. I'm not advocating that NATO should go by satellites and shoot it up into space, but there's a need for a policy framework, coordination, and so forth. And to bring all this together, because of Ukraine, NATO needs to take a hard look at what hybrid warfare means for the alliance, and this sort of in-between, or state of in-between that we have found ourselves in with Ukraine, and to some degree with Georgia when it happened. And how does that relate to current NATO capabilities, or what kind of responses do we have to develop to respond to hybrid warfare? So that's my second theme of new threats and challenges and capabilities. And third, you sort of want to echo what Heather said about the United States. NATO is very important to the United States, but it's also important for NATO countries to remember that the United States is a global power with global reach and global interests. And the U.S. certainly has alliances and relationships with non-NATO countries that are extremely important, ranging from an Australia to an Israel to Japan, and in the Pacific century, those relationships will grow in importance as well. So from a Washington perspective, NATO cannot only be about Europe. European security is incredibly important, but to convince Washingtonians over the long term that NATO is relevant to them, it cannot only be about defending Europe. So broadly speaking, the US is looking for its European partners and allies to also be partners and allies for global action on global security issues, one way or another. So again, the need for the transatlantic bargain, what will the US do for Europe, but also what will Europe do for the United States over the long term? And again, as Heather suggested, a good first step would be increased defense spending. I was struck by the Bob Gates speech, his farewell speech in Brussels. It was a real attempt by him to sort of shake up Europe when it came to the capabilities gaps and funding. Unfortunately, I think it actually had a bigger impact in Washington, and folks in Congress sort of said, "Yeah, he's right. They don't do their part. So why should we help them carry the load?" I don't think that was the effect that he was seeking, but that was unfortunately what happened. And the last point on this, quite frankly, the sort of NATO family, as we call it in Washington, is small. And getting smaller. There may be, 50 folks that do, no, okay, so even less, that do sort of NATO and European issues for a living. Yeah, there are people that, they may pass through a desk, they're on the NATO desk, they're on the Belgium desk, what have you, and then they move on. But folks who sort of do this as a career, either in, via government or think tanks or industry, is really, and Heather and I know them all.
So we see each other a lot.
So in that sense, the constituency for sort of European issues alone is actually is small, and that's something that needs to be remembered in Europe. Heather and I are working hard to grow that constituency and keep the community alive. But in that sense, the old generation from the Cold War is really really departing, and Bob Gates in many ways may have been the last one from that great generation. There's a couple others, a Brzezinski, a Scowcroft, but they're getting up there as well. So my last point on all this, certainly lots of challenges. These are troubled times. I think the global political environment is increasingly competitive, not only with a reasserted Russia, but also an emerging China and other major powers. So the environment is certainly competitive. But I think there is a silver lining here. Just a few months ago, we in Washington were worried sick about what do we do with NATO when Afghanistan is over? What's the rationale? What are we going to do? What's the story? What's the narrative? And I think the narrative has actually been supplied to us.
Thank you, Mr. Putin.
So there is hope for a reinvigorated NATO here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Exactly right.
Thank you, Magnus. Just a quick question to you. You talk about all these new challenges and also new geographical areas that NATO should focus on. But at the same time, we have the defense budget cuts, both in the European countries and in the US. Can NATO afford all this? I mean, shouldn't Europe be the main priority? Heather talked about coming home, coming to Europe.
Sure, no, and that's a legitimate question. And when I say out of area or sort of global action, it does not necessarily have to be in a war fight context. For lack of a better term, there are certainly things such as capacity building, or even so. For example, if you take the issue of Pacific security, I'm under no illusions that we will see European deployments or major European deployments to the Pacific. Maybe the French and the British will pay a visit, but under no illusions. But there are other ways that Europe plays a role in Pacific security. For example, European defense contractors are doing brisk business in Asia, which is great for them. But those but defense trade also creates linkages, political and military linkages. So it is an indirect way for Europe to actually indirectly help shape the Pacific security environment, moving forward, and that is not something that takes deployments or lots of people and so forth. There are also other issues such as the global commons, so the maritime commons, cyberspace, airspace that we all depend on and are directly of interest to Europe because Europe is as dependent on trade and global communications as the United States is, and under here you can fit counter-piracy operations, cybersecurity, access to space, norms for behavior in space, and so on. So that is actually it speaks directly to European interests, and I think there are ways to collaborate about which does not necessarily include large deployments of people in uniform or a lot of money, because what we first and foremost need all the times is policy frameworks and a common U.S. and European approach to some of these issues.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mike.
Thank you, Katarina. And also, thanks for inviting me to this excellent panel. So far, excellent, that is, because Magnus and Heather are among the people I always try to see when I'm in DC myself, which happens quite regularly. So, I kind of concur with what Heather said almost entirely. However, though, I have three major takeaways from Heather that could be discussed perhaps even more in the next panel, actually, because they deal with the consequences of all this for the Nordic states and Sweden and Finland in particular. And they are, first of all, as Heather said, that Russia is now an adversary. This is a strong statement, but I think it's increasingly true, and we need to take that into consideration here. This does not only go for the United States, of course, it does go for this entire region of the world. Secondly, Heather said as well that NATO will focus at Cardiff and onwards on traditional collective territorial defense issues. This is also highly significant for the role of NATO in this area, in the Baltic Sea region in particular, I would say. And thirdly, the Cardiff Summit in September will not enhance the NATO partnerships. You didn't say enhance, but I think that was what you meant, essentially. And this is, of course, a major thing for Swedish policy as it has been kind of executed up to now, at least, because the partnership thing was the key NATO-related issue for both Swedish and, I believe, as well, Finnish policy. So these issues are very interesting. They also point at extremely significant needs for maybe redefining or at least rethinking of Swedish and Finnish security policy as a whole. But I would then also want to return to the Heather question, if you wish, and that was essentially why nobody could foresee that this would happen only 6 months ago. We are pretty bad at our business if we, as analysts of this whole business, cannot say or cannot foresee such big developments such as these. But this has to do with the essential kind of short-sightedness, I would say, of the profession, and that's unfortunate because if you look at the general view, both in academia and in media and in other contexts of NATO and the transatlantic relations, especially from a security policy point of view, over a few decades, you can easily see, to paraphrase a good book title, that this is a continuing story of a death foretold. You see all the time, at least once a decade or so, definite and very confident utterances from both policymakers and analysts that NATO is dying or NATO is dead. We have heard that for years. Let me just take a few examples. In 1956, only some 7 years after the formation of NATO, we had the Suez Crisis, as you know, when the Americans, together with the Soviet Union, to be sure, went completely against what was then seen as major British and French national interests. This was then, for the French in particular, a sign of the non-desirability of NATO as such. Then in the 1960s, we had a lot of problems with the nuclear issues, nuclear sharing and so on. In the 1970s, we had all the turbulence related to the Vietnam War, but also a lot of general anti-NATO sentiments, and NATO was declared dead then as well.